Most marketers understand the importance of A/B testing for optimizing marketing campaigns. However, surprisingly, many are not up to speed on best practices for doing this successfully. Sometimes, even a simple tweak or modification can have game-changing impacts on the success of your marketing, your sales, and on your company's bottom line. While there's a lot of conversation around A/B testing, there's surprisingly very little clarity. This leaves marketers knowing that they could be doing better, but with no clear direction of how to do it. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome back to A Seat at the Table, where we sit down with leading executives, entrepreneurs, and innovators and get first-hand insights into how we can make our businesses more successful. Today we're joined by Nils Koopelmann, founder of 3Tech, a company that focuses on conversion optimization and experimentation to help e-commerce companies make better decisions in order to drive growth. Nils will be speaking about the fundamentals of A/B testing and how it impacts business growth. He'll be providing practical tips for conducting successful A/B tests. He'll be talking about success factors for data-driven growth strategies and how A/B testing can contribute to increasing e-commerce conversion rates and revenue. While marketing solutions rely on testing alternative solutions, filling executive positions needs to be much more precise. However, finding the right people to fill executive positions is not always easy. In fact, it has become increasingly difficult. That's why leading organizations turn to AsiaNet consultants. AsiaNet has a well-earned reputation for being able to recruit candidates for even some of the toughest search assignments. To find out more about them, check out their website at asianetconsultants.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes for this episode. Meanwhile, let's sit down with Nils and learn how to turn our e-commerce business into a growth machine. Nils, thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table. I'm really interested in what you have to say around A/B testing. I think that nowadays, so many people are trying to use digital marketing, particularly within e-commerce. And let's face it, it's challenging to get the kind of results that we want. Conversion is really not that easy under the best of circumstances. So it'll be really excellent to hear your views on this.
Yeah, so I think over the last couple of years, something we did in fact realize was that we might have very good ideas of how to optimize something, maybe a marketing campaign, some changes to a website or whatever it is, right? But one of the things we always forget is that we are not necessarily the customers,
right,
or the consumers, the people actually making the decision. For example, we work with a lot of e-com companies that operate an online store, and something that's always there is people, even in the company, they have had many touch points with customers, right, in customer support or in other forms, but still they are not the customers. So this is usually where A/B testing comes in, is trying to take assumptions in form of a hypothesis and just testing it against the real world, which is the consumers we face every day. And by having this tool, really, it's just a tool. It's not a magic pill, not a magic box or anything, which some people think it is. But by having this tool and being able to statistically find out if a change actually brings by the needed results or the results we want, this is like sometimes feels like magic, but it really isn't. It's just applying a statistical method to a change that would otherwise just be guesswork.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point. And it's very easy for people to fall in love with their own products or to have certain ideas about what people will like or won't like, which is so different than what the market reaction is. I mean, it's something I had to learn the hard way myself, is not to worry about what colors I like, what logo I like, what wording I like, because sometimes what I like, nobody else likes, like typically. So your point about testing gives you that feedback.
Yeah, exactly. It's like oftentimes we have feedback loops even in. It's super interesting because sometimes people think they're testing when really they're just rolling out and somewhat validating some ideas with feedback. But
Right.
For example, especially with A/B testing, and when it's done right, it's also maybe a consideration to take into account. But when it's done right, it can really be a tool that you can also spread across the company, right? So it doesn't necessarily is limited to, say, changes on the website, but you can also test, for example, email headlines, something we as a company don't necessarily do, but we also help our clients understand that this testing mindset is something, if adopted, can really become a driving force within the company to rule out just opinion, which is important, but shouldn't be the leading factor in making decisions, but to actually then have a tool that helps you create data that wasn't there before, and then just push out the guesswork, have decisions that are based on data.
Yeah, so important to be able to take that personal bias out. Can you give an example of how this might work? Just a simple example, perhaps using a website or an email.
Sure. So with an email, let's start with an email, even though that's not what we do, but it might be somewhat tangible. So think about the sometimes hundreds of emails you get in your inbox a day, and assume you're sending out a newsletter, right? And you're kind of dependent as the producer of that newsletter for people to open it, because if they don't open it, they will never see all the good things in there. So what's often done is that people try various approaches of a subject line. So they might try something very catchy or something very descriptive, right? And that's the version A and B. So instead of just sending out the same email with the same headline to, say, 1,000 people, you now send 50% or a small portion of the people, you send out both headlines. And then after some amount is reached of people who received the email, you can draw a statistical conclusion of which one of these headlines actually works better and results in higher open rates. And this is the same principle, while it works a bit different, technically speaking, for email, that is applied to on a website. For example, if we want to understand if the kind of product description we currently have on a product detail page, right? That's the page where the product is displayed and people try to find out if that's the right product for them. Then we could, for example, just give them different information about a certain product on the variation, whereas the control stays the same. In web, it's a bit different. Like when we talk websites, we usually show 50% of people version A and 50% version B. And sometimes it's stuff like changes in, for example, the pictures we show people, right? A super typical example, if I look at a very standard Shopify shop, oftentimes people just put very, sorry to say it, but lame product pictures in there that don't show any benefit. And then, but what we could, for example, do is like look at what really resonates with people and create a hypothesis on what would help people better understand the real benefit of these products. Put them in the product images, and then show the second half of the people, the variation, the 50%, these new images. And later we could conclude based on, say, for example, if this test were to run for weeks and we would reach statistical significance, for example, then we could say, okay, now which one did perform better? Which one did result in more sales? Which one did result in more people actually looking through the image gallery or stuff like that? And this is basically in taking a simple change that we could have just rolled out and get some tangible information, some tangible results from it, and make an informed business decision whether or not to implement this change. And sometimes, I mean, the world is a bit more complex, of course, than just making one change. Sometimes it's a flat result, and then we just need to change and iterate. And yeah, so
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Example.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's something that it's sort of a difficult process to set up if you've never done it before. But once you get it set up, I can see how the results that you're getting, the feedback, can be just game changing. Because as you said, sometimes you just need to change a small thing and you don't understand why you're not getting any conversion or any clicks or interest on something. And perhaps it's just that something that you think is very clear, actually the person who's seeing it for the first time doesn't really understand, like you're saying, what it is you're presenting.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times when we talk about small changes, right? If you just look for conversion rate optimization, also a term that is widely used, right? If you look for conversion optimization hacks or how to increase your conversion rate online, you will get hundreds of articles, blog articles that rank very, very well. And they give you sometimes, and I was recently giving a webinar about this or a similar topic as well, but they give you so many hacks and tips and tricks on how to optimize your website. But what's often just left out of the picture is whether or not this one change or all of them actually make a difference for your specific audience, for your customers. And that again is like where guesswork and best practices and all this like comes into play. And where with A/B testing, at least that's one way, but we try to rule out these, again, just this guesswork. And of course, what we try to do as a company who does this like basically every day is like we try to not just come up with these ideas, but we try to do research to make, even on the front end of this, create more informed ideas and ways to change this based on real user behavior. And there is, of course, various ways in how we do this. I mean, if you want to, we can happily go into that, but there is a real process behind it. And I think anyone really with a bit of interest in this topic, who wants to optimize their website, their shop, and really wants to try to understand their customers, if they apply this process or a similar one, and can have tremendous results. So you see, I'm really passionate about it.
So you said you can talk a little bit about how you do it, and I think that's really interesting for people, myself included, because I'm aware of this. I'm certainly, having had my hands in the clay on a lot of different things with regard to digital media and so forth, and yet there's a lot I can learn about this. And so I'm sure that people listening would love to really go a little deeper on this.
Sure, I'm happy to share. So if we specifically talk about research and trying to understand consumer or customer behavior, what's really important is to see that there's various ways of tapping into this behavior. And I try to look at it from a lens of how we can basically cluster these research methods. And so one is definitely qualitative research, which often it could be like talking to customers. It is so simple, and it might be obvious, but if you just think about, even as a normal business, not even online, just talking to consumers and understanding their problems is such a game changer. And this is like one of the first things that we do when starting with a new client. We talk with customers. Of course, we might not do it on a one-to-one scale, but we might just ask questions in a survey, right? We have a framework for that, where we try to understand, based on a given set of questions, why customers, or at that point, maybe even just prospects, for example, leave the site, what their initial intent was when coming to a website. And we also, when people made a purchase decision after, like post-purchase, we might just send them a survey asking a couple of very specific and product-oriented questions of why they ended up choosing the product. But even on the front end, why they might not have almost chosen this product, for example. This is on the voice of customer side, where it's more direct. If you look at a standard product on Amazon, you certainly know, and probably also look at when making a decision of whether or not to get this product, you look at the recommendations, right? So this is oftentimes one of the most underrated, maybe a little pun there, but underrated resource or source of just finding out what people really enjoy about the product, what they hate about the product, why they switched from other competitors to your product, and stuff like this. And sometimes it's even cool to look at competitors' reviews, because then you understand the selling angle that they might be going after or identify for some there. So this is on the voice of customer side. Then there is also, I'm a big data guy. So we, of course, look into sources like Google Analytics, and if set up into BigQuery and other like data warehouses of companies, where we try to leverage the data that's there and better understand consumer behavior. So trying to figure out, for example, very simple, but where do people drop off throughout the customer journey? Where do we have, and we can also leverage stuff like heat maps there, which is basically a map that's overlaid over a screenshot of the site, where we can see where do people actually click in a very visual way, and see, do people actually interact with the elements that we want them to, or that we think would help them make a decision, for example. Then there's also something that's more on the heuristic side, where we take our expert opinion that we built up over the years and go through a site, analyze literally every single pixel, and look at what does every single element do for what stage of the customer journey, or how might it inhibit certain actions, or whatever it is. We go through, scan the site, and do a real like CRO audit. And yeah, so there is like various ways of doing this research. Of course, we can go even more in depth when with a couple bigger brands, we oftentimes go into doing scientific research. And this is, for example, just looking at papers and trying to find out where have people already done sometimes peer-reviewed studies in regard to, for example, car buying behavior. We were working with this one client who sells used cars, or they basically offer a platform for buying and selling used cars. We used scientific studies there to better understand what goes into the decision-making process of buying a car, because we might have our own opinion of how we would approach it, but certainly there is way more information out there on how this works on a larger scale. So yeah, this might be a little peek into how research could look like. But of course, if we take all this research, then that's just a big bloat of maybe we oftentimes do a presentation to also make it somewhat tangible. But as a next step, what we usually do is we try to identify customer problems. And from these customer problems, we define what we call overarching behavior hypotheses, which is basically our idea of how we would solve these problems. And then this is already diving a bit deeper into our process, but what we then do within these, let's say, buckets of hypotheses is create individual test ideas with hypotheses, and then step by step create a roadmap of how to test these. And this is where the fun begins for us usually, because then we can see which of our assumptions actually work and what is driving the growth for our customers or for our clients. And yeah, then this is just an iterative process after that.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And you're right. You sort of have to lay that foundation. And then after that, you can continue to fine tune and tweak things and try to, I guess, ultimately end up at your optimal either headline or copy on your website or visual presentation or whatever you're testing for. Now, what happens to companies? And maybe it isn't possible. And if it isn't, just that's okay too. But if you're a big company, you probably have the resources to either have develop your own team or outsource. But what happens to companies that are smaller? And either this is going to be one person doing it or maybe a fraction of a person. Is that doable, or is this something that they just can't really get involved in just yet?
So it's an interesting question, and I would like to answer it on two separate levels, because one is bigger companies, especially if they're consumer facing and not B2B, because that's usually a different case, but they do have usually a lot of traffic, which in a way builds the foundation or is a requirement for A/B testing. Of course, there's also a lot of small companies who have huge amounts of traffic because now we have paid social and all these kind of channels. But usually if a company is too small and there is certain thresholds that need to be taken into account for A/B testing to make sense, if a company is too small for that, I highly advise against it. And there's other ways of then validating ideas, validating change. That said, if a company wants to do that internally with only very limited resources, it's a hard decision to make. Because if you try to take only limited resources, but expect big results, which is usually what people have, then it's a slippery slope. And that one person just will overwork themselves and might not be able to even focus on all that. What I recommend, especially in these cases, is working either with freelancers or agencies who can help with that. That said, also they need resources. So, and of course, I'm running an agency, so I kind of have this perspective, but I'll later share also why there's cases where it does not make sense at all. And so, yeah, I think getting outside help up until the point, and this is where I think it gets interesting, up until the point you can build your own team. And for example, what I always like to do is, because hiring an agency and basically buying a black box or whatever it's called, I don't think really makes a lot of sense for a lot of companies. Because yeah, you want, for example, your conversion rate to be increased or whatever metric it is that is right now relevant for your growth framework. But you also want to build that knowledge. You want to have these processes internally at some point. So what I always advise is that we're basically a sparings partner for these companies that want to build up these processes, who turn the first couple iterations of what we call the experimentation flywheel, actually a concept that was developed initially by Microsoft, but basically helping them build up an experimentation program, like a testing program. And then over time, once they have seen, like once we've proven that this general idea of A/B testing and experimentation works, slowly but surely building up internal resources. Because in my opinion, there is no way that, and this is me as an agency saying this, but that we could scale the experimentation program of a company to the degree where everybody in the company, and I'm talking even large organizations here, would be running experiments. That's not the idea. So we basically want to help companies kickstart experimentation programs so that at some point these growth effects can take over and inspire really everyone in the company to run experiments. That said, because your question was initially catered towards what can small companies do. And I think if it's just one or two people in the company that have like very limited resources, you will never get to the point where you have the experimentation, what we call experimentation maturity, to run a large scale program. What you can do though is identify what is most important for your growth right now and allocate these resources there. And for sure, then you can think about how to use and really allocate these resources. Maybe this is in internal ideation or just doing research internally. And then maybe if resources are really limited, just getting outside help for individual functions. For example, getting a developer from outside to help with developing A/B tests or developing other changes. And so I think there is various ways of attacking this. What I always suggest is just looking where you are right now, being very realistic with what you can do with the resources you have, and then being a bit creative and just trying things out. Even if, like, for example, it doesn't work with just an agency, then maybe look at the way you were operating did really make sense. And so I think experimentation and CRO is not just limited to the big players, but there has certainly to be some consideration put in if you are smaller or don't have a lot of resources, and maybe try things that are more in the growth hacking approach, because you need to make big bets as a small company. There is no point in going for 1 or 2% changes if really what you need is like big turnovers, right?
I think you're 100% right on that. And you do see smaller companies trying to emulate what corporations do, and it's not successful. And in the case of, like you're saying, some of this A/B testing and so forth, if you don't have an initial volume of data to work with, that also skews the results that you're getting because it's just too small a data set. You talk about the challenges and solutions in the field of growth marketing. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see people facing? Because right now it really seems people are facing a lot of challenges.
So one thing before I go answer the question. So I just want to clarify, it's not only corporations, of course, that can do A/B testing. It's just more a question of the traffic you have, and if you have the resources to then employ this kind of bigger process. But it's of course not limited to corporations, but also right. But there's a lower bound. But to your questions in regard to the biggest challenges in growth marketing, I think for one, growth marketing or growth hacking or whatever it's called, growth in general is a big topic, and we could go into very different areas here. If I look specifically at like website optimization, which is where an experimentation where my experience and my expertise lies in, I think it is as simple as two things. one making decisions oftentimes based on intuition and previous experience, which is not the worst, but still, especially intuition can be very misleading. So this is definitely one. And the second one is not taking customers into consideration. And I've seen teams where, and I even read a anecdote about this recently, where teams happily present that they've now been very customer driven and they try to be very consumer centric, whatever the buzzword is at this moment. But then if you ask, like, with how many customers they've spoken, the answer oftentimes is like none, or maybe 5 or something like that, right? Where you try to really optimize your product, your marketing for the end consumer in mind, but you never talk to them. They are not part of the process. And this is something where I see companies that really succeed in one, building product. This could be a real in-person, like a tangible product, or a SaaS app, or whatever it is. These companies succeed because they build the product based on real needs that they validate, and that oftentimes the consumers, the customers that actually put money on the table, help them validate, that help them build this product. And I think these two things, one, being more data-driven in your decision-making and less intuitive, even though that's not necessarily, or in general, a bad thing, but just being data-driven, or at least data-informed, and then taking your real customers into consideration. I think these two things are two of the biggest challenges, not necessarily because they are hard, but because both of them are, for a big part of the people working right now, still an unintuitive way of working. So yeah, I think if I had to also probably offer help in these areas, it would be these two things: helping people make more data-driven decisions and helping them become more customer-centric. And in a way, this is really what all our work is about. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I like the fact that you point out being more customer-centric, because a lot of people talk about that, but very few people execute on it, not because of bad intention, but I think a lot of it is just because people don't 100% know how or what they should be doing. So I think it's great that you were able to provide insight into that.
Yeah, I actually sometimes, or try to do it more often, but on LinkedIn, just share also very practical examples of how that could look like. And recently I was sharing, I think, a post, and I'll just rephrase it in a way here on the podcast, but it was just call your customers, or find a way for people in marketing, just sit at a customer support spot for a minute and just try for a day to understand what the real problems customers have every day are. And I think this is advice that I could even give to CEOs, right, that drive the company. Just get down to the core level of the company, talk to the people who actually are the driving force, right, which is the customers, the consumers, and talk with them. And it doesn't, of course, have to be like you have to call them every single day. That's not the point, but just finding channels of interacting with them. And this is also where I think when community management is done right, can be, or communities for example, D2C brands, can be a huge resource, even channel for retention growth and all these kind of things. But yeah, can highly recommend talk to your customers.
I think that's really critical advice, Nils, and I totally agree. It's a shame in a sense, but people, particularly in the C-suite, are so tied up with doing other things to run the company that we don't think about the fact that you need to get in touch with customers, like you say, sort of tap into those support lines, or get on the selling floor, whatever the case may be, and really, get up close and personal with who is your customer and what are their frustration points and things like that. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I all the time mention to customers if we're in consulting sessions, or even just like in podcasts like this, because I think it's such an undervalued part of running a business, or at least underutilized, that I think if deployed across more companies can really, really help better understand your customers. And then using that information, of course, to also do something with it. Because there is no point in, for example, talking with customers and then just being like, oh, I talked with customers, nice. No, you have to act on that and build a really particular plan of what are you going to do with these insights that you generate, because otherwise it's just a waste of time. But yeah, just trying to be empathetic with your customers and also try to make their life better, because this is what it's all about. And no customer cares about your conversion rate. Nobody cares about how much revenue you make, how many sales. What they care about is if they are actually if you're solving their problem. And yeah, I think that's what we really should get behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nils, you've shared so many interesting things here. How can people get in touch with you?
So what I recommend is just going on LinkedIn, because this is where I spend probably way too much time on, and share hopefully interesting things about A/B testing, experimentation, conversion rate optimization. And what I also recommend, if people want to dive a bit further, is subscribing to my newsletter. It's Experimentation Tuesday. It's a weekly newsletter I send out almost every week. And yeah, with tips and tricks, or just generally information about the world of CRO and experimentation. So LinkedIn and my newsletter, it's both on my profile there.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to make sure to include all of that in the show notes. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us here on A Seat at the Table.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here, and looking forward to maybe a next episode at some point.
Absolutely.